This episode of Bitcoin People proudly brought to you by Looking Glass Education, bringing you easy-to-read, beginner-friendly financial education that helps you take control of your financial future. And it's all free, so go check it out. Hi everyone, this is Carrie C from the Bitcoin People Show. The upcoming is a recording of a talk that I made to a branch meeting of the Libertarian Party here in Australia. And my camcorder didn't work on the night, so I'm doing this as a recording of the talk after the actual event. The reason that I've made the recording is that my hope is that it might be useful to somebody else who equally wants to speak to their own local Libertarian Party. So along with the slide pack, which we're including as a downloadable piece in its own right, I'm including the recording as one way of making the content flow and giving you an example of how this material can be put together. Now, I was only given half an hour on the night, and so I've tried to stick with that discipline in this recording. I think it goes a little over. It might be 40 minutes. For anyone who's an experienced Bitcoiner out there, you're going to see vast, massive, yawning gaps in the information. I start off with the history of money, and I try and cover that off in less than 3 minutes. So there's obvious gaps in there. I don't get to go into decentralization to the degree that I would like, or cryptography, or SHA-256, or Metcalfe's law, or there's so much that, of course, we know there's hundreds of hours that could be included. This was meant to be an introduction to Bitcoin for the Libertarian Party, and it was literally just that, but it was followed up. It was interesting that it generated probably 2 hours of questions afterwards, and people were still going well into the evening, even after the official event was over. So it was a fun event, and I'm hoping it's useful content and it provides value to anybody else who's starting to think about putting some materials and some ideas together as educational sessions to their local politicians. I would like to follow this up at some stage with further recordings on the case for the Conservative Party and the case for progressives. So there's many different ways we can, of course, tailor this content to meet the outcomes and desires of many different people, but the shared values that at a very human level, many of us have in common. So enjoy. I hope it's useful. All the best. Okay, we're going to kick off here with a quote. And the quote is from Buckminster Fuller. "You never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete." Now, that is the way of technology, and that is the way of businesses over the course of human history. So let's have a look at what that means for Bitcoin and what it means for libertarianism. I've titled this after this came from Alex Gladstein, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Human Rights Foundation. And so it's his quote, "Bitcoin is a Trojan horse to freedom." What it means is we're building this thing under their noses and under their feet, and there's nothing that they can do about it. And it can build out from a grassroots level upwards an enormous freedom infrastructure. Just to introduce myself, I'm Carrie C. I'm a small business owner, and I was smashed during the COVID lockdown. So I've been in small business for 28 years. I do corporate training, presentation skills, writing skills, influencing skills, difficult conversation skills, so all those business communications things. I would have lasted if there had been a year's worth of lockdowns, but because of the open, shut nature of how it all worked here in Melbourne, Australia, that went to pieces during the second year, and it's rebuilt, but nowhere near back to where it was. So in that time, I started looking for an alternative sort of source of income. And I came across Bitcoin because a girlfriend of mine was into it and other alts, and she was trading and she was doing very well and she was making a lot of money. And eventually over time I separated Bitcoin out from the rest of the crypto industry and understood it to be a very, very different beast. And so I went hard down the avenue of Bitcoin, and I ended up even creating my own YouTube podcast because I'm hugely enthusiastic about it and I love talking to people about Bitcoin. So that's called, if you want to look it up, Bitcoin People. Through that process, through the Bitcoin community, I heard about libertarianism, and I looked up libertarianism in Australia, and I looked up Libertarian Party in Australia, and I came across what was then known as the Liberal Democrats and is now known as the Libertarian Party of Australia, and I joined, and I've been involved through a couple of campaigns now, state and federal elections. I've been a freedom lover from way back. It's a value that's dear to my heart. I'm Jewish. My mother was brought up during the war. Her brothers were fighting in the war. Her cousin was in concentration camp. So this is a value that's really dear to me, and I had a very visceral reaction to those lockdowns, and I think that's why I was drawn so strongly both to Bitcoin and libertarianism. All right, let's move on with it. 3 areas we're going to cover off today. I want to talk about how corrupt money corrupts governments and how corrupt governments corrupt money, and that sort of circular relationship. We'll move on to how Bitcoin is the soundest money ever created. And we'll also talk about, of course, what this means for the Libertarian Party. All right, quick history of money. Now, this is very Bitcoin 101 and Money 101. There's a huge depth we could go into with any one of the slides in this pack and a whole lot more. So please excuse, I'm keeping this for the sake of brevity and clarity and simplicity and succinctness. I'm not going to do full justice to each of these topics. Okay, so the history of money goes something like this, and many of you would be aware, and there's many blips and there's many kind of shades of grey and nuances that happened along the way. But fundamentally, you could say that. We started with barter, whereby, you had a goat, I had a pig, we swapped. But maybe you had a goat and I had an apple orchard, and I go to give you 50 apples or 100 apples for your goat, and that's not very practical because I can't use those 100 apples. I can't get through them before they rot. So what we needed was a separate, third, trusted object that would serve as being something that was equally valuable to both of us, and to price it against that third object. And we explored everything from shells to glass beads, and then when metals, we got into copper and silver and ultimately gold. And the reason why gold stuck, and it stuck for 5,000 years, was not only is it shiny and pretty, but more importantly, it's durable, and it's also scarce. So relative to copper and silver, it's not as easy to find, and so that scarcity gives it quality. It gives it intrinsic value. So, for instance, if I try to pay you in sand, a handful of sand, that's not useful to you because I can go and get my own handful of sand, so there's no scarcity to it. If I try to pay you in a bottle of oxygen, enormously useful oxygen, I think we can all agree, but it doesn't have value because it's not scarce. Unless I'm underwater, then it becomes enormously valuable and I'll pay my entire life worth for it, yeah? So the scarcity matters. Now, what happened in 1971 with Richard Nixon came into power, and there was an issue where US was really fundamentally on the verge of defaulting. So I've missed a step. What happened with the gold over time was it wasn't entirely practical for transporting large quantities across large distances. There were always Robin Hoods on the road, or, if you're doing international trade, it's slow, it's cumbersome, it's heavy. So they started to issue certificates against that gold. They would keep the gold in a bank, hence the beginning of banks, and they would issue a certificate against it, and you could redeem that certificate for your gold. Great, except that what happened over time is they would keep less and less gold in the bank and issue more and more of these certificates because they realised people weren't going to take out all their gold at once, and that became what's known as fractional reserve banking. And then eventually, just to add insult to injury, this piece with Richard Nixon in 1971, he decoupled from the gold standard altogether. France and Britain were coming over to collect their gold that was being held in the US bank, and they didn't have enough of it. So they just decoupled altogether and they issued something that became paper money. And that paper money is not backed by anything. It is not backed by gold. And it is called fiat money because it is Latin for by decree. The US government decrees, this is what you will use. This is legal tender. Only this is legal tender. You have to use this and you have to trust us. But the problem is with fiat money, because it's not backed by anything, they are untethered in their capacity to print new money. They can do as much as they like, so it becomes like sand again, or it becomes like air. It becomes meaningless. It devalues in purchasing power, which means in effect the flip side of that, or another way of looking at it or seeing it, is that prices increase compared to the value of the dollar that you have in your hands. And so with increase in print supply of money, the value of that trends towards zero. It decreases, it debases. So what does that money print look like? You can see slow increase in money supply over time. Gold was 2% roughly in inflation. That's about how much they would pull out of the ground every year. So that was about 2% compared to the size of gold that was held by human beings already. But what happened in 1971 was that started to increase and increase, and you can see the slope of the curve. Like you can see the speed at which the amount of money that they're printing is increasing and increasing. You can see all the way over here in 2020 with COVID, kaboom, straight up, almost vertical, massive printing that went on through 2020, which accounts for the inflation that we're seeing today, the decrease in purchasing power of our dollars. Now, inflation has some positives for the well-off in the world. So let's have a look at that. So how does this work out? What happens when you've got all that money printing and sloshing around? It's good for governments because it makes their debt cheap. So what we mean by that is they've issued treasury bonds. That's a form of borrowing money. So they sell treasury bonds that offer an interest rate. China, Russia, Japan, big financial institutions buy those because they get an interest rate on them, and it's supposedly very safe, so it's a very safe interest rate for them. But what that means is when they then print money, which technically isn't printing, it's the buying back of some treasuries, but that requires the financial markets who have those treasuries to rebalance their assets and to bring on board either buy new treasuries so newly issued treasuries, or to rebalance their portfolios in other ways, which we'll get to in a moment. But fundamentally, what that means is that the government can paper over, they can pay their debt with newly printed, minted money through this treasury issuance process. And so it makes their debt cheap. It's a way of papering over their debts rather than actually paying them back out of GDP and out of taxes. So there's no checks and balances. It's unfettered money printing. This works out absolutely fine for the wealthy classes and those particularly in financial markets and big financial institutions and banks, because what happens is those banks have to rebalance their portfolios, having sold off their treasuries back to the central bank. And what that means is they buy other assets. They buy new treasuries. They buy property in the form of mortgage-backed securities. They buy potentially gold or some sort of gold futures or synthetic on gold. They might buy shares, of course, is a huge part of that, because they've got to keep making a return. They're private enterprises, so they can't just have money sitting around doing nothing. They've got to make money on it somehow. So what happens is all of those big financial institutions are creating demand for all these assets, for property, for gold, for shares, and those inflate. That's known as asset inflation. Those inflate faster than the regular rate of inflation, the inflation rate for our goods and services. So they're fine. Their asset prices are outstripping inflation, and therefore they are they don't care about inflation. It just doesn't bother them at all. And whereas once we get down to real people, that inflation trickles down into the rest of the economy. Our regular everyday goods and services go up in price. but we don't necessarily have property, shares, fixed interest, gold to offset that price. So we've just got to deal with it out of our wages, and our wages aren't going up as fast as inflation. Okay, so herein lies the problem of money printing and why this corrupt money corrupts government, because of course now what happens is they've got money also to swell their ranks, to get bigger and to be even greater a power and control and greater influence in our lives and intervention in our lives, because they are simply physically bigger and they start to outrank us as human beings. So whereas the power structure is meant to be they're representing us, they're working for us, it becomes the other way and they start to control us through this money supply process. Okay. The next step in this is that there's going to be what they are all talking about, what they are all creating, and what China is leading the way on, has already led the way on, is central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which is this emergent dystopian future. So this allows them even more control. When there's no such thing as cash, I can't even go down to the shop and buy my groceries with cash. Everything has to be done digitally now. Now, most of it already is, but this takes it to the next step. Now, what we've already seen that they can do with digital currency, because our money in the bank is really just zeros and ones, it's just numbers on a computer, is they can freeze our bank accounts. So that's what we saw with the Canadian truck drivers, was frozen. Their bank accounts were frozen because they disagreed with what the government was doing. They were creating an inconvenience. They were gathering power and momentum. And so what the government did was shut down their bank accounts so they could not access their own money. This is where Bitcoin came in. Bitcoiners around the world started sending them Bitcoin because that cannot be frozen, and we're getting to that. So CBDCs increase their control and their capacity to freeze or confiscate our funds. That could look like in the future, we don't agree with this merchant, we're cutting off all business with this merchant. You won't be able to use your currency with this merchant, and fundamentally shut down a business that doesn't agree with them. Equally with the individuals. The other thing they can do, which China has already brought in, is an expiration date, so that the money has to be used within a particular time and you can't save for your future and for your retirement. They can also, of course, inflate it exactly as they can do with the current currency through the ability to print CBDCs at the click of a button. That swells the size of government, as we've already talked about, by a greater inflation, which is in effect another tax on the everyday person, and they can continue to increase their taxes and continue to enforce the taxes by growing their ranks and by growing their government intervention. Okay. So it's all looking pretty ugly and pretty dystopian. Let's move on to have a look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the soundest money ever created. The way we talk about this in the Bitcoin community is that in relation to this problem of inflation and CBDCs, Bitcoin fixes this. So how does Bitcoin fix this? What is Bitcoin? Let's just take a quote for a moment from Milton Friedman. This was in 1999. He made this comment. He is the free market economist and Nobel laureate. He said, "I think that the internet is going to be one of the major forces for reducing the role of government. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, is a reliable e-cash. A method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. So this is just like the way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you and there's no record of where it came from. So what it means is over the internet, I can send you Bitcoin and you can send me Bitcoin, and we don't have to trust each other. That's just a given. We don't need a trusted third party. It doesn't have to go via a bank. So we can transact directly with one another. Okay, so let's just talk about how it is both freedom technology and also ultimately savings technology. In terms of freedom technology, first and foremost, The Bitcoin is a digital peer-to-peer money. It's not run or controlled by anyone. It is a protocol that was released on the 3rd of January 2009. It is a blockchain, so it's a ledger, that's an online ledger that keeps all the transactions that have ever been done in Bitcoin verified and then recorded on this blockchain. And everyone around the world has to agree and verify, all the nodes, all the people creating this blockchain, creating the blocks on the blockchain, have to verify the transaction to make sure it's legitimate, and they need to then and maintain the ledger by creating a block with transactions printed onto it, in effect. On top of that blockchain is this Bitcoin as currency, so that you can be using it as currency and the transactions are recorded then on the blockchain. That's what Bitcoin fundamentally is. It's a digital peer-to-peer money, and it's not run or controlled by anyone. There's no government controlling it. There's no business. There's no executive. There's no person. There's no group of people. There's nothing. It's a protocol that keeps just churning itself out, one block after another, every roughly 10 minutes at a time. So that's the essence of what Bitcoin is. It's permissionless. It can be sent to anyone, anywhere, anytime, without permission or surveillance, instantly and at very low fees. It's really fast. I was sending some Bitcoin to someone overseas in Sweden recently, and I went to send him a little note, a little text to say I've just sent it, and before my thumbs could go sent it, he had sent back a text saying got it. Now, admittedly, he had one less letter to type than me, but he was faster than me. It had gotten there that quickly. No third party, nobody intervening, him to me, like handing over $20 from Australia to Sweden. It is censorship resistant. It can't be stopped from being sent and received by any third party. It's confiscation resistant. It can't be stolen by a person with a bigger stick. Nobody can come into my home and steal my cash from under my bed, my gold in the safe, my share certificate. I don't think you could do that, but you'd need a digital identity. But whatever it is, the history of humanity is people coming in and stealing the land and the resources of another country because they have better technology, better weaponry, faster weaponry, more sophisticated, superior weaponry fundamentally. And he with the bigger stick, with the best weaponry, wins. And that can't happen with Bitcoin because you're holding what I'm going to call a password. It's called a seed phrase in your head, and nobody knows how much you've got and nobody knows how to access that, because if you die with that seed phrase in your head, the Bitcoin fundamentally goes with you. So it's not useful to kill you. They can't get anything from you that way. It's also got a predictable money supply. So there's a maximum part of that protocol that started churning out in 2009 every 10 minutes. So it's been going for 14 years, unfettered, untouched, just keeps growing and growing and growing. And part of that process is that it will stop when it hits 21 million Bitcoin. So what does that look like in terms, therefore, of pricing? What we've got now is scarcity. There is something that is absolutely scarce on the planet. You can argue nothing else is absolutely scarce on the planet. There are usually substitutes for everything else. There's a substitute for gold in terms of its utility. There's a substitute for oil in terms of renewable technologies. There's no substitute for Bitcoin. It is a hard currency. There's nothing that can rival it. That's a long discussion in its own right, and we could go into depth in that. I'm going to leave it at that for the time being. But what it means is, because it's absolutely scarce, that it becomes more valuable over time as more and more people discover the power of it, and they hang on to their Bitcoin and they don't let it go and they don't sell it. And then more and more people cotton onto it and they hang on to it and they don't sell it. And so what you've got is this graph. This is a logarithmic chart of the price of Bitcoin. And as you can see, it's going up and to the right. Okay. The other reason why we're very early in the process and we are still ahead of governments and institutions in terms of adoption here, we need to take into account that it's a technology and it's a disruptive technology. So we have to look at not only Bitcoin as money, but also as technology. So what are we saying here? There's what's known, as you can see on the left-hand side, a theoretical adoption curve with technology. Typically goes through what's known as an S-curve, whereby it increases in adoption and slowly and then very quickly, and then there's a few tail end Charlies who pick it up at the end. So what you can see on the right-hand side is that in action. What you can see in the if you have a look at the telephone and electricity and cars, etc. Say the telephone and electricity was slightly bumpy in the process of adoption because it's got to be rolled out at a physical level through all the households of the entire city for them to become valuable. If there's only 2 people with a telephone, that's not terribly valuable yet. We need that network effect before it becomes meaningful. So what you can see as you come over here, though, to video games, PCs, cell phones, all in the greens and yellows here, internet and digital cameras, etc., is really almost a vertical adoption curve, whereas Bitcoin is still in its very early days. And part of that is, bear in mind, there is no big company behind it putting millions of dollars of marketing into this project. It is a groundswell, word of mouth, individuals discovering it, understanding it, and then educating their family and friends. So that's all there is going on here. So it's a little slower in the adoption at the beginning, but what we're seeing is increasing. We're getting momentum, and we're moving towards a kind of what do they call it? That tipping point. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to talk about what Bitcoin isn't and some of the concerns that people have with Bitcoin. So some people are concerned by the fact that it's not backed by government. That is a good thing. That is the point of the exercise. We are happy with that. That nobody can therefore print it. But it does mean that you have to take personal responsibility, a little bit like your cash under the mattress. You have to protect it very safely at home. So there is a bit of technical know-how required just to familiarise yourself with how that is done. People are concerned that it's a high user of energy. Well, the question on that is, versus what? Nobody seems to have a problem with the usage of energy in banking to build all those banks, all the people required to build the banks, all the mining required for the bricks, the clay, the cement and mortar, all of that infrastructure, all the people who are devoted to keeping the banking system running, all of that is energy. Gold mining, huge energy to mine gold. Nobody seems to have a problem with that. So compared to what? It is also, please bear in mind, deliberately reverse engineered to use a lot of energy because that is its security. It's like a moat of energy usage that creates this security function around the Bitcoin protocol and the blockchain. So the idea with that is that really at this stage, given it's grown so much, that the more it's round, the bigger the network, the larger the number of nodes and verifiers and miners and wallet holders across the universe, the harder it is to hack. You would just about need all the energy in the world today to now try to find a way to kind of hack that system with what's known as a 51% attack to take over 51% of the nodes and the mining operations. It also uses roughly in the vicinity of 60% of renewable energies, which is higher, is my understanding, than any other industry in the world. And we can even use what's called stranded energy, which is the energy that is wasted in a bunch of energy industries. So, for instance, the gas industry, when you see those gas flares, that's the burn off of wasted energy, wasted gas. That can be used by Bitcoin miners to create the security for the system. So that's unlike, again, any other industry in the world. People are concerned that it's commonly used by criminals. They're estimating, they've done estimations on this, that it's maybe 0.25% of Bitcoin is used by criminals, whereas something like 2 to 5% of traditional finance is used by criminals. So cash is basically the preferred currency of criminals. Governments can shut it down. Well, look, they can't shut down the protocol. If they could have done within the last 14 years of its existence, they probably would have done. What they can do is shut down the what are known as the on and off ramps, which are basically the exchanges where you might buy Bitcoin, and certainly China and Russia have done that in the past, and that could force it to go underground for a little while. But Russia and China have found a little bit like that game in the that you get at circuses or at fairs, where you have to knock down all the heads and you've got to get them all down at once. The issue is it's very difficult to get them all down at once, or maybe it's a little bit like Hydra, where you cut off one snake head and 10 others grow in its place. So it's very, very difficult to control, and Russia and China have fundamentally given in each time and allowed mining back in, and therefore usage of Bitcoin back into their economies. Other people are concerned about the volatility of it against the US dollar price. So I just want to clarify a couple of things about this. We need to consider short-term volatility of price action versus long-term risk. And if you consider the risk of inflation and the risk of money printing to be the debasement of your currency fundamentally to zero over time, then the risk of Bitcoin is negligent in comparison. So this is about fundamental risk analysis versus sheer volatility of price in the short term. And you've really got to think long term with Bitcoin. This is about the next minimum 20 years, 50 years, intergenerational, multi-intergenerational, 100 years, 1,000 years in advance. So it's a long-term hedge against the system versus the short-term price fluctuations. And bear in mind, it's also early days. So Amazon was equally volatile in its early days as a tech stock, if you like. It's almost equally volatile now if you were to compare the charts, and it's 10 years older with 2.5 times the size, the market capitalization of Bitcoin. So you would have thought it had stabled out, but even there it is still a pretty volatile price. So nobody seems to be concerned about the volatility of every other asset versus the US dollar. Okay, let's move on to what all of this means for libertarians. How does Bitcoin help libertarians? Well, Libertarian Party is the natural party of freedom. That's what we are all about. Freedom from government intervention, from big government. And Bitcoin is the ultimate expression of freedom and liberty. So I'm going to quote Alex Gladstein once again, the Chief Strategy Officer for the Human Rights Foundation, from whom we got Bitcoin as the Trojan horse to freedom. If we want to fight Big Brother, decentralized money is key. This is the way we work together at the people level. Doesn't matter which side of politics, it's irrelevant whether you're left or right, or what, this thing works for everybody at every level and everywhere along the spectrum politically. Okay, what does it mean we can do as a libertarian party? At the individual level, I would recommend studying Bitcoin, learning about it, understanding some of this stuff more deeply so you can feel more secure about it, more confident in it. You can even buy a little bit of Bitcoin, just $20 worth, buy a tiny amount, and that will give you a kind of vested interest and give you familiarity with the process of buying and how does it work and how do you look after your own money, etc. At the party treasury level, again, you might want to consider buying Bitcoin as part of the treasury operation for the long-term savings. In Victoria, we have this issue for the independent parties outside of the two majors where no one donor can make more than $4,000 donation to the Libertarian Party. This is a way around that. So Bitcoin cannot be controlled by anyone. And then finally, we can have a look at including party policies around it. We can align with the Bitcoin community. We can create kind of a camaraderie and a way to work together in that space. And there's already a number of US politicians forming policies around this. So I heard Robert F. Kennedy speak at the Miami conference this year, 2023, and he spoke about his 6-part Bitcoin policy. And I've done an adaptation of it here for Australia. I've got a link here if you're interested in going to his talk. This is a slightly more Australian version of it, but ideas like defending the right of self-custody of Bitcoin, making sure that is entrenched in legislation. Uphold the right to run a node at home. Remove any tariffs for Bitcoin energy use. So at the moment in America, I don't know about this in Australia, there's additional tariffs. You have to pay more if you're using your energy. They differentiate between whether you're using your energy for home usage or for Bitcoin mining, and they add a tariff if you're Bitcoin mining. That needs to be removed. We could make Australia a global hub for Bitcoin and keep a whole lot of innovation and talent at home. There is a fight over people who are capable in this space at the moment because there are all sorts of second layer businesses building out on this Bitcoin network, and you want to keep that smarts at home. We also want to advocate, of course, for sensible Bitcoin regulation so that people can feel safe investing in it. So those are some ideas to play with as a party in relation to Bitcoin policy. To wrap things up, there are over 200 million wallet holders across the world in Bitcoin. This thing is taking off. It is huge in Africa. It is where there's an enormous amount of financial literacy. I've done interviews with people in Africa, and I'm coming up to do some interviews in South America as well. Bitcoin adoption is happening with or without government approval. It is happening gradually, but one day it will happen suddenly. You've got nations like the BRICS nations, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, who are looking at ways of trading with each other outside of the US dollar. Russia, just like the Canadian truckers, had their SWIFT account for their the settlement of their international trades was frozen. And so they had the same experience as the Canadian truckers at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. And so they're looking for ways out of the traditional system. And Bitcoin is a nice neutral. They don't necessarily want to trade in the Chinese yuan or the Russian ruble. Nobody necessarily trusts or particularly values one another's currencies. And so this is where Bitcoin could provide neutral territory. And, you've got a lot of smart, capable tech people in Russia and China who will be already understanding the value proposition of Bitcoin. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're not secretly buying some Bitcoin on the side for their own treasuries. So Bitcoin is this quiet revolution. It's our Trojan horse to freedom, and it cannot be stopped. So I highly recommend that we as libertarians and as a Libertarian Party get on top of it now, familiarize ourselves with it, think about the ways we can leverage this power, because it is going to be an enormously powerful force for freedom in the future. All the best. Take care for now.